Feeling a little quirky tonight, my friends. So I'll give you fair warning. Welcome aboard to Fishing Without Bait, a lifetime without definitive expectations. Whether you've got here by accident or on purpose, or perhaps just woke up and found yourself here, you're not in a dream, you're not in a nightmare. You're with Fishing Without Bait and Full Impact Mindfulness. Hello, my name is Jim Ellermeyer. I'm a behavioral health therapist, and there is no admission fees for being here. All you required is the honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness to try. If you're welcome nowhere else, you're certainly welcome here. And as always, we like to catch up with some of our guests from the past. And one of our favorite guests is Professor Buzzkill. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, please catch his podcast, please catch his videos, and please catch our previous episodes on The Complete Angler, which is not about fishing. So, and as always, welcome, Joe. Welcome aboard. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me back.
Yes.
Very rarely when someone with the name Professor Buzzkill gets invited back to places.
So,
because you get thrown out.
So if we have our listening audience out there who doesn't want to go back through and catch the meaning and how Professor Buzzkill came to be, could you explain that, please?
Well, it's good that you asked me today because I just got back. Today was a big teaching day for me. And it was the first time that I can remember, this semester was the first time, I think the first time ever, that all my students have been born in the 21st century.
Ah.
So that was a big thing. So not only do they not get my jokes or things I reference, I have to say, I used to have to say ask your parents. Now I say ask your grandparents. And I say that because it's the students who named me Professor Buzzkill about 10 years ago, because I used to always bust myths that they would bring in stories they'd pulled off the internet or quotes they'd heard. Did so and so do this? Did so and so do that? Or say this? Say that?
So
and I'd always say no.
You may have been the original MythBuster.
No. I think there were those two guys that in the '90s that had that show before YouTube, MythBusters, and they would do sort of sciencey things.
Yes.
I think I'm the first history one. So that's why. So we started the podcast that way, and like you say, everything's at professorbuzzkill.com, and we try to do a podcast a week, and then meet with our friends on their podcasts and their videocasts.
So could you share with us today what our discussion may center around?
Well, it centers around, what I suggested to you when we talked about this before was to refer to and analyze a speech that Martin Luther King gave in 1967 called "Where Do We Go From Here?" And it was a very important chronological point in the civil rights movement because there had been a great number of successes, but there was still a lot more yet to do. And King gives this speech. It's a very famous speech, one of his top 5 famous speeches. But as I say to people all the time, they only know this speech from the little brief inspirational clips, like at the end, the flights of rhetoric, the references just to spirituality or to things like that. There's an awful lot more in the speech and in all the work that he did that we really need to try to remember and try to recall.
So have you ever heard the term when people suddenly make it? They get discovered in a film, or they have a best-selling novel, or a song that hits the charts. People refer to them as an overnight success. Are you familiar with the term, I'm a 20-year overnight success?
Well, almost everybody is, because, of course, this speech, for instance, given in 1967, Dr. King makes his first sort of national impact in the Birmingham bus boycott in 1955, and really starts early in the 50s. So he's an almost 20-year overnight success. But people forget about that. They think that you go from the sitting in at lunch counters to the "I have a dream" speech the next day, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is passed. Well, there's an immense amount of work that's done first of all, there are a lot of intervening years, and there's an immense amount of work being done in those intervening years to get this stuff done.
So when people know of Dr. King, they mainly know of these sound bites.
The sound bites. And that's one of the things that distresses us most, distresses historians most, about the way people see history. They think of these little clips, JFK saying, ask not, blah, 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 blah. And we tend to forget, we tend to overlook all the stuff that goes into making either those sound bites or those policy directions or those attempts to improve something or any sort of political progress or anything like that takes years and years and years of effort. And as everybody also says, in addition to the overdose, is the 10,000 hours thing. You know, in order to be good at anything, in order to accomplish anything, you have to have put in 10,000 hours in your lifetime.
That kind of reminds me of when there's a huge public works project, maybe
Right.
there's a groundbreaking ceremony for a building or whatever. They have the people with these golden shovels, and they're all
Yeah.
sitting there with a little bit of dirt in their spade, but that's the last effort that they're going to make at that building.
But that's the picture that gets in the paper.
Correct.
Whereas the folks who did all the hard work over years planning and then actually doing it get largely forgotten.
So quite often in my practice, what we do as a person, I'll have a person, what do they want to do? They want to set a goal, okay? And I'll have them build a pyramid. And the goal's on the top, let's say buying a house. And so if you and I would say, let's buy a house together. Oh, that's great. So we get in a car and we start running around looking for homes. We don't want to do the steps that it takes to make a goal happen.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about, you're familiar with Dr. King's struggles. Tell us a little bit about what you know about what he went through.
Well, he goes through an awful lot. I mean, he starting back in the 50s, as I say, with people like Rosa Parks and other civil rights, early civil rights campaigners in the South. They start to first organize as ministers and other civil rights, if you will, pioneers, to work on specific things like the Montgomery bus boycott, like the lunch counter boycotts. And this, over the next 10, 15 years, develops not only as an effective civil rights movement, but as an effective political movement, because it breaks out of Birmingham, it breaks out of the South, and it turns into something that gets national attention. But, like you say, he's not only a pastor all this time, he's working, I don't know how in the world he ever had time to have children, because he's working all full day as a pastor. He's working every night on any number of committees, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, et cetera, to get civil rights action, civil rights legislation passed or proposed at least. And he does this in the South, in Georgia, in Alabama, and in the other deep states, deep southern states, without any sort of glory or without any spotlight or anything on him at all. So, if you see pictures of his early campaigns in the early 50s, he's very young. We look at him because he was very young. He's 30 years old when he starts all this stuff. And it's just astounding to think that he is able to start with that intensity, but keep it going the whole time.
I think that people don't realize the depth of and the meaning of discrimination and the imprisonment, the strictures that black people had in the South. Could you say some of the things that people actually had to put up with?
Well, they had to put up with almost complete segregation. They had a number of legal rights, but they were legal rights on paper. So, for instance, 3 important constitutional amendments are passed after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, outlawing slavery, banning slavery, giving African American citizenship, and also giving African American men the right to vote. And then later, African American women are also given the right to vote. But the way our government is set up, state governments, the way national government is set up, state governments can put in all these clauses or all these special cases that Dr. King refers to in the speech we're going to talk about tonight, interposition and nullification, right? The state capital in Atlanta can get in the way of civil rights legislation and say, oh yes, you have the right to vote, but you have to pay a poll tax. You have the right to vote, but you have to pass a literacy test. You have the right to vote, but you have to do all these things. And they're all aimed at very, very poor, disenfranchised people, right? And these are overwhelmingly African American. They're so brazen at the time that when they're sitting in their state legislatures writing this stuff, they actually talk about it. we don't want to have blacks voting, so let's have a poll tax because that won't technically be unconstitutional, blah, 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 blah. So they're openly saying, and there are minutes being taken by the secretaries and everything else, that we want to discriminate against black people, but we're going to have to do it in this sort of special backdoor manner. And what that means is every black person in the South, certainly, and in great many places in the North, lives, there are two societies. There's a fully black society, often the other side of the tracks, and a fully white society, and they're not integrated at all. And black people have a lot of rights on paper, but in fact, almost none of them can be used in practice.
So I hope everybody's seen the pictures of 2 water fountains labeled, restrooms labeled,
Right.
schools labeled,
Yeah.
not allowed to go into libraries, not allowed to be friends with a black person.
Right. Not allowed to eat at a lunch counter or what we would today call a deli.
Yes. I particularly remember, Professor, the scene when the schools, in particularly Alabama, and I remember George Wallace standing in front of the course with an axe handle in his hand. And President Eisenhower had to send in the 102nd Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles.
Yeah.
And that picture, or that film of these 5 little black children being surrounded by paratroopers with rifles
In order for them to go to school.
and the white people standing there screaming these horrible things at these children.
It's almost impossible to overestimate or over-exaggerate the level of discrimination and racism at the time. There's still obviously a lot of it now, but the way it was so open and so visible and so vicious is astounding. Every time, the more I look into it, I'm getting in the sort of last few decades of my career now, and I keep thinking, someday I won't be shocked. And every single time I look into something new about this, I'm shocked at how bad it was.
So Dr. King was the face of the civil rights movement back then.
Well, he became the face.
Yes.
Let's say that. He
Yes, he
starts
did.
off as one of a dozen top people, and then ultimately it becomes. But people like John Lewis were very important, who's still alive. Ralph Abernathy was very important. Rosa Parks is very important. People think of Rosa Parks as being this meek housewife who just sits down on the bus because she's tired and just is too tired to get up and refuses to move her seat. Well, all of that was planned by the civil rights workers in. All that was planned by civil rights workers in advance, right? They wanted to have this purposeful action where Rosa Parks is going to sit down and refuse. Now, she says to the press, I'm just tired, but it was an immense amount of work and planning and bravery when it went into the planning and execution of that. So eventually through the 60s, he becomes the most famous.
Right.
But even then, after his death, it's almost as if the whole civil rights movement gets wrapped up in one person, and that's unfortunate because there are a lot of people.
Well, we tend to develop cults of personality.
Cults of personality, very strong thing.
And the groupthink, the leader. However, people don't look at everything that went into. So for our listeners out there, if you're involved in a business, if you're organizing a fund drive, if you're organizing a school dance, if you're even planning a play date for your children, there's action and effort that is involved in that.
And other people, almost always other people too.
So I think now's a good time to introduce the lottery story, which I talk about in recovery and at rehabs. Most people live their lives on wishing and hoping and waiting for something to happen. One of the famous union slogans is, let George do it. Mm-hmm. Let George do it. So there was a person who prayed to win the lottery every day, Professor. Sweat blood. Nothing ever happened. And they got so angry one day that they ran outside and they yelled up at this guy. They said, God, please let me win the lottery. Why won't you let me win the lottery? And God called back down and says, could you meet me halfway and at least buy a ticket? So this is what I impress upon people. Yeah. Buy the ticket.
Right. And in order to buy the ticket towards greater progress in civil rights, you have to start by doing something like not staging, but directly doing a sit-in on the bus. or sit in at the Woolworth lunch counters.
So there's a couple of things that prevent people from moving ahead, Professor. One is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of humiliation, fear of failure, and in this particular case, fear of your life.
Fear of your life, exactly that.
And the next thing is needing the approval of others to do it.
Well, and I think why this relates so well to your work is because Martin Luther King and all of his colleagues worked together. So Ralph Abernathy's was just as important in the sort of theology and philosophy behind this movement. And there was sort of a safety in numbers. They felt not only safe with each other, but they felt, okay, I want to be seen. In fact, King says this a lot. I want to be thought well of by Dr. Abernathy. I'm sure Abernathy thought the same thing. So I'm working hard for my people, but I'm also working hard because he's watching me. And Abernathy knows I'm working hard because King is watching me. And the younger people in the movement, like Jesse Jackson, are looking up to these leaders. So there's a kind of safety in numbers aspect, and there's an inspiration in numbers aspect.
So let's get into his speech. What can you tell us about this speech?
Well, this is a speech that he gives to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is one of two major organizations that King was involved with. Well, at least two major organizations King was involved with. And on August 16th, 1967, in Georgia, this is the 11th annual SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Convention in Atlanta. And the SCLC is really the group, it's not only the think tank for putting forward civil rights reform ideas, it is the group that organizes and gets the stuff done. Okay, so it's really the big one. We tend to think of the NAACP as the big one. This one in the 50s and 60s was the big one.
So you're talking about the actual soldiers.
The actual soldiers, and there are a lot of them. I think Dr. King would say, and a good person to ask would be Jesse Jackson because he's still alive, or John Lewis because he's still alive. How many people do you think were, at least as responsible for these changes as Dr. King? And they'd probably say 100. There were probably 100 leaders that were as important as Dr. King, but of course he becomes the figurehead. The reason why this convention is so important and why this speech is so important is because in 1967, if you will, the moderate civil rights campaigners, King, Abernathy, right, are starting to lose some traction in the African American community, and more radical campaigners like Malcolm X are capturing more and more attention. And it looks to moderates as if, the civil rights movement is slipping away from us, and I don't mean they're not being selfish about it, but they don't want to see it go down a radical, dangerous / violent road. And so he entitles this speech, "Where do we go from here?" And that's why it's so pivotal, even though it's only a year before he's shot. How do we handle this new thing going on? How do we handle the fact that the radical aspect of the African American community or the radical section of the civil rights movement is starting to make the rest of us look more radical, and we're actually losing white support. People forget that Martin Luther King was very highly regarded in northern white circles for the longest time until the mid to late 60s, when the radicals on the fringes of the civil rights movement started to sort of he got tarred with that brush too.
Guilt by association.
Guilt by association. Yeah.
Right. So people have a tendency, we all have a tendency, that we want results and we want them now.
Right.
Now, as far back, look at the Bible's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
They were so disappointed that he wasn't a great leader and was going to kick the Romans out of Israel.
Yeah, that's right. It never happens that way. But you see, as we look back, we only look back in sound bites or video bites or whatever we want to call them. And so we see things like Kennedy in 1961 says, "We pledge before this decade is out to land a man on the moon and return him to the earth." And then the very next clip, 5 seconds later, is Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. Looks like it happened the next day. Or Ronald Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and then you see the wall coming down. Mm-hmm. In reality, there were years in between the statement and the action, and a lot of other people did a lot of things to get those things done.
Well, we're taught now that people have, as we talked earlier, quick forgetters.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we constantly need to have something put in front of our face that is either outrageous
Mm-hmm.
or incredibly interesting or, unfortunately, something showing the misfortune of others.
Right. I think that's so true. And, drama sells. And so when more people go on YouTube and look at the news clips, the clips of the YouTube videos about the news reports of Dr. King's assassination, then look at news clips or news documentaries about the actual bus boycott or the sit-ins at Woolworths lunch counters and things like that. The tragedy draws people in, and the tragedy only takes a millisecond because he gets shot. That's what people want to see.
Well,
the number on YouTube, I've looked at the numbers for these things, for MLK and for JFK and even for Bobby Kennedy. It's just distressing. Everyone wants to see the assassinations. No one wants to see the.
They want to see the train wreck.
The assassinations, but
they want to see the train wreck. They want to see the car wreck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's too bad because so much, as we talked about, so much goes into doing it, to doing what needs to be done.
Well, Dr. King goes into detail in this speech about what it takes to get things done.
Right. I mean, I prepared for us a document of this speech, of the full text of the speech as it's given. It's 9 pages long, single spaced, right, double sided. Okay, this is a speech takes over an hour to give, so your listeners should go online and listen to the full text of the speech rather than the full audio of the speech rather than the last 5 seconds. And as I've said before, in planning this show, he spends at least 50% of this time talking about the direct action the civil rights movement took, especially consumer boycotts. And to me, that was, when I first started looking into this a couple of years ago, that was just an astounding thing because, of course, as we keep saying, you never hear about those things happening and you never hear about them being praised in this way.
Well, we talk about people, we talk about our memories. Memories are formed by strong emotional arousal,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And generally when you're reading through this wonderful speech, it's all really good stuff, but there's nothing in there that would elicit strong emotions. We can all agree on it.
No, well, unless you're there.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing that in the text that I have, the people who transcribed it have put in the audience interjections.
So
I know that there's a great line early on this speech, one that I know that you like, and that where King says, "In short, over the last 10 years," this is early on in the speech, first page. "In short, over the last 10 years, the Negro decided to straighten his back up," and the audience interjects, "Yes, realizing that a man cannot ride your back unless it's bent." Yes, that's right, people are shouting. So, and this is in the before he, well, sort of in the beginning of the stage where he starts to talk about specific boycotts and specific shoe leather work, what we used to call shoe leather work, being out there on the streets actually doing stuff.
beating the streets.
The whole idea that it's perfectly good for us to talk about inspirational things, and those things are very, very important. But as you can see, the sort of mathematics I did on about how many academics call this content analysis. How many words are you being spoken on a specific subject in a speech? I've got 50% of his time in this speech is talking about the detail work, talking about boycotting ice cream, boycotting Coca-Cola, boycotting this, boycotting A&P. Well, half of these things, well, Coca-Cola still exists, but A&P doesn't exist anymore, neither does Seal Test ice cream.
You have to actually have people who will not go into the stores, not just Dr. King or any of the 100 leaders
Right.
doing that.
And they did it. And this is the type of thing that's completely forgotten. A lot of people know about the bus boycott. A lot of people know about the Woolworth lunch counter boycotts because a lot of those are filmed and the confrontations are filmed. But I don't know of any news footage of people boycotting A&P because A&P's hiring practices were discriminatory in Alabama, and the SCLC essentially, through what's called Operation Breadbasket,
Yes.
gets the A&P to change that policy almost overnight when the entire community, the entire African-American community boycotts A&P, and A&P realizes, We can't afford to be this racist.
So when Dr. King in here talks about empowering the community, he talks about them empowering through their purchasing power.
Yes. And one of the quotes is, I can't remember exactly where it is, and I might get the wording slightly wrong, but what he says is that we have to make these people understand, if you respect my dollar, you must respect my person.
Yes.
I'm not going to spend my dollar with you if you're not going to hire, if you don't hire the same percent of African Americans that are in the town. I'm not going to spend my dollar with you if I have to go entirely across town to get this ice cream because you won't put an A&P market in an African American neighborhood. On and on and on and on and on. And it works.
Yes, it does.
Every single time this worked. Every single time the big companies back down.
Absolutely, because of the power of the dollar.
Power of the dollar.
So I like it here when Dr. King talks about moving with strength and dignity, having courage. And George Adair always one of our favorite topics is talking on this show is about fear, which is the most fundamental emotion that people have. And I love this line here where he says, he came out of his struggle integrated only slightly in the external society, but here it is, but powerfully integrated within.
Right.
This reminds me of the 12-step world where we talk about it's our singleness of purpose that binds us together.
Yeah, and I think another part of this speech anyway is he says, he's constantly reminding his followers, we're not going to, as he says, act bad. We're not going to do violence, and we're not going to throw a brick through your window. But we are, and so he's trying to calm the white community, but also, or convince the white community not to be worried about African American violence, but also remind his followers, we have to take the high road here. We can do a consumer boycott. We can do a lunch counter boycott. We can do a bus boycott. We can bring these institutions to their knees, at least for a little while, but we have to do it with purity of purpose, and we have to do it without any violence or any, as he famously says, acting bad, which is sort of, early 20th century parental advice. Don't go acting bad. Well, and I think that's again, that works, right?
People marching down the street with signs and screaming will get some airtime.
Yeah.
However, having like Henry David Thoreau, civil disobedience, okay? And actually, the Quakers were kind of the people in England who kind of really invented civil disobedience. They told the king, well, we're not going to fight for you. However, we're not going to fight against you. And they had civil disobedience. And this is what Dr. King's talking about, and also voting with the dollars. One of the things that I'd like you to talk about, Professor, is when they talk about this 120 synonyms for blackness, and most of them are offensive, and 134 synonyms for whiteness, and they're all favorable.
Right. This is a concept that's actually sort of brought up early on in the 60s and really capitalized by Malcolm X, who says, we have these things called white lies. It's a lie, but it's okay. Miss America is white. Your sins are as black as coal. The word black seems to always be added to intensify the negativity of something, and the word white is almost always used to purify intensify the purity of something. So a white angel, a white halo, these kinds of things. And Dr. King has gone through and gone in dictionaries and thesauruses and said, look, this is the problem. People think of the black-hearted beast and the knight on the white charger, and so it gives two things happen. African Americans get sort of this internalized idea that black is bad, and white people get this the mirror opposite, that white is good, and both of those extremes are wrong.
Well, if you're reading the Christian Bible and people refer to the darkness, what are they referring to? Evil.
Right. But so often, at least as the language has developed, evil has been characterized as black, the
Yes.
color black.
Yes.
And of course, African American people aren't black. They're not they're not black like the tiles on this thing, but
Of course.
people have conceived that they are darker, and so they then jump to the extreme. Oh, he's a little bit darker than me. That means he's black. And I'm pink, but I need to take it to an extreme, so I'm white. And so these extremes are crazy.
Well, we're all colored.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Black is the absence of color, white is the absence of color.
Dr. King talks about people developing their own Emancipation Proclamation.
Uh-huh.
I was in Boston a few years ago and was visiting some places, so I came up with a podcast on people writing their own Declaration of Independence from whatever they feel is constraining them in their life, whether that's chewing your fingernails or whatever. But people always say, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can. America's a land of opportunity. They weren't given the opportunity.
No, absolutely not. And he says that over and over again in this speech and other speeches. And the sociological research and evidence on this is overwhelming. Every possible bootstrap is denied to them. So you literally can't do it.
Dr. King says in here that the plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power,
Right.
both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness.
Right. But then he also goes on to say that and in this speech and in the speech he gave the night before he was assassinated, famously called the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech, another just fabulous speech. And again, another speech where the first half of it is largely ignored by history documentaries. He talks about African Americans as a nation, if you will, as a group, have the purchasing power greater than all but 9 countries in the world. So this is in the 60s. So if you took the economic power of all the countries in the world, or all the groups of people in the world, the first 10 would be the U.S., Canada, Britain, Germany, and whatever, Soviet Union. Well, African American purchasing power is number 10 in the world, and there are 250 countries or whatever. So he's saying we have all this power, we just don't realize it. And if we withhold the 10th largest the 10th largest amount of dollars from American retailers, they are going to listen to us. This is our Declaration of Independence. We not only need to fight against legal restriction, legal segregation, but economic segregation.
So what we want to do is figure out, evaluate and inventory our strengths, talents, and abilities.
And I think a lot of us don't know we don't realize how I would have thought if I'd have been an African. I didn't know this at all until he said it, and I fact checked it. It was true. I didn't know that was possible. And I think today of the environmental movement, if the environmental movement got together, the purchasing power of all the environmentalists in the world would be number 5 or 6 in the world. And so in our personal lives, we don't think, hey, wait a minute, I have the power to make a decision to do something that not only affects me but affects my immediate environment.
So when I'm with the patients, the people that I deal with, Professor, I often say to them, I'm not interested in what you can't do. Right. What I'm interested is what you can do. Mm-hmm. And we're going to reverse the lenses in your glasses. I'd like you to make an inventory of your strengths, your talents and abilities, or your group's strengths, talents, and abilities. Right. And no one moves from a position of strength. No one moves from a position of weakness, ever.
But as you say, you have to sit down and really think carefully what the strengths you have are, because there are strengths, well, at least what Dr. King is saying about the civil rights movement in the African American community is we have these strengths that we don't know we have. And when you actually put them together in conglomeration in community, we're incredibly powerful.
It's not burning down someone's building or their house, or throwing rocks, or doing those types of things. Dr. King, I love when Walter Reuther, Dr. King named him, and Walter Reuther said, power is having people say yes when they want to say no.
Yeah, right.
That's power.
And I hope Fishing Without Bait listeners don't mind that I actually read that full quote, because
Please.
Dr. King says, Walter Reuther, who was a great big union leader back in the 50s and 40s, 50s and 60s, and I'll quote Dr. King here. Walter Reuther defined power one day. He said, quote, "Power is the ability of a labor union like UAW, United Auto Workers, to make the most powerful corporation in the world, General Motors, say yes when it wants to say no." That's power. That's the economic power that he's talking about, that African Americans have harnessed and need to keep harnessing in order to bring about change.
So quotes are often misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. King says there's nothing wrong with power if it's used correctly.
No, right.
So that reminds me of the Paul in the Bible. He's often misquoted. The only portion of the statement they use is money is the root of all evil.
Right.
When actually what he truly said was the love of money is
yeah.
the root of all evil. People just seem to leave that out.
No, that's right. That's right. And as Dr. King says here, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
So when people say love conquers all, love with power may conquer all.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Dr. King says.
Yeah.
Love is wonderful. However, we have to have some depth and weight behind that.
Yeah.
In the 12-step world, it said that the message that can interest and hold these people must have depth and weight.
Right.
We just can't say, do it because it's good for you. You have to
Yeah.
show them how it's going to be good for you.
That's what interests me so much. You know, I see so many of these books, for instance, on historical figures like Dr. King, like Winston Churchill, and there's a lot of them are, you know, how you can lead your organization like Churchill. Churchill's leadership strategies for marketing in the 21st century. And they're just as shallow as they can be, and unfortunately they're overlooking what the people really did that could be applied to marketing strategies in the 21st century. But no, they want the nice little quote that fits on the tweet or whatever, and not go any deeper. And that's exactly what you're saying. Going the depth is absolutely essential.
When he says, and I say to you today, now this is back in 1967,
Yeah.
if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust, evil war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put on a man in the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. But, you know,
Right.
that type of thought is an anathema to people who worship money.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, one of the first things he did was stood in front of the Curia, the religious body who makes things happen there. He said to them, one of the first things he said to them, "You have lost your way."
Right. Right. Well, and I think, I just give a personal opinion, our country's lost its way, because not only was the national spending out of balance back then, it's still out of balance. 55% of national income goes to the military. 55%. And most people who complain about the government complain that it all goes to welfare mothers and stuff, and then it's literally untrue. So, you know, our priorities are backwards, and all kinds of people, moderates like Eisenhower, kept telling us about this. This is a problem. It's going to get worse and going to get worse, and it never gets addressed.
Well, people always say, you know, invest in the military, invest in the military. I think it would blow people's minds if they understood that the United States spends more money on defense than the Soviet Union, Russia,
Yeah.
and China,
Mm-hmm.
and the next 7 countries behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Russia outspends us. No, they don't.
No.
We dwarf them.
Yeah, it is an enormous amount of money, and the percentage is really, really very, very troubling. If you look at the military percentage, 55% versus the educational percentage, which is like 16%, it's really, you know, what does that say about our values?
Well, sometimes I irritate people, and I'm not running the friendship club. So I tell people that it's not being a mama, it's not being a daddy, it's not being a brother or a sister or a friend or an employee that define who you are. It's your values and your choices that define who you are.
Yeah.
Your values and your choices.
Right.
And I think we see what's a lot of whoever has the power, values and choices are today.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And even though we've had some great people in our past try to point those things out to us. Again, we don't pay enough attention, and then we idolize them for a much, much smaller slice of what they actually did, even though that's a very admirable thing too, right? The inspirational speeches and the motivation, all that's very, very, very important. But we've forgotten this message of get to work.
So, have you ever heard somebody really ought to do something about that?
Well, I was thinking,
how often is that said?
Yeah, well, exactly, and somebody, what they really mean is somebody else ought to do something about that.
Absolutely. Gee, why isn't somebody doing something about that?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I don't have any of those answers, except that I think that this speech specifically is an excellent model.
Well, Mahatma Gandhi said, "Be the change that you want to do in the world." People say, "Well, what can I do?"
Mm-hmm.
I don't do anything. People just seem to walk past. One of Pink Floyd's best songs, I think it was absolutely inspired, was For the Turning Away. And
I can't remember.
Yeah,
that was high school for me.
Well, he talks about they talk about For the Turning Away, about how people shun or turn away from people who need help.
Right. Well, and as you've mentioned stories in the Bible before, what makes the Good Samaritan the Good Samaritan is he looks down at the injured traveler, and unlike the other two people that pass by, doesn't think, what's going to happen if I step down to help this person? What's going to happen to me? The Good Samaritan thinks, if I don't step down to help this person, what's going to happen to him?
Well, as you like to provide the details behind the story and history, a little bit, and we did actually a podcast on this. Samaria was northern Israel, okay, and what the Iranian, the Persian Empire, other empires, one of their favorite tactics was when they conquered a part of a country, they would remove the elites, okay, and take them to their own country, and they would replace them, integrate them with their own people, and they would intermarry with the people, with the Jewish people there, and that was an anathema for the Orthodox Jews,
right?
Okay, that these people would intermarry with infidels or Gentiles, okay, so they named them Samaritans. So Samaritans were despised in Israel and in Jerusalem, which was Jesus's point in that, saying,
because this is the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, here's this despised individual, and all these so-called righteous people walk past them. A Pharisee, the people, Levites, would walk past this man who was one of their own,
right?
And when a despised person took pity on that person, and Jesus at the end of that story says, "Who's this person's brother?"
Right. Exactly. Well, you know more about the ancient history and the biblical history than I do. I get to, one of my favorite things in history to do is to employ our famous get out clause, which is to say, that's not my period. I do 19th century history, and so I can say I'm not an expert in that. But that's certainly the story. That's certainly the Bible story. Right?
However, most people, and I love this line that Dr. King says, "This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action."
Yeah.
And I tell people, I say, you know what? All you're doing is preaching to the choir. You're sitting in a room full of individuals who agree with what you say, and you're all justifiably outraged.
Yeah. But then you go home and don't do anything about it.
That's correct. What I suggest to people is advocate for the people who have some power and support the causes that you support. Support those people. And I challenge people to do that.
Yeah.
But everybody, how many people, I don't want to get involved. One of the famous lines, I don't have a dog in that fight.
Yeah. And when Dr. King and other people are saying, neither did the Good Samaritan, but he did it anyway.
Not at all. Because in the 12-step world, one of the main philosophies is do the next right thing.
Right.
Do the next right thing. It's just amazing.
And not be satisfied if the conditions around you aren't right. In fact, Dr. King again sort of starts concluding his speech by saying, let's go out. I want to conclude today by saying today that we have a task, and let us go out with a divine dissatisfaction. We don't like the way these things are, and we're going to do something about it. We have a task to do rather than just talk about it.
Well, when something offends people's sensibilities, they just want to remove it.
Right.
Well, the homeless people, let's put them in jail. These people, let's just get them out of our sight. Let's just put them in jail. Or years ago when the solution for capital punishment, well, just kill them. Capital punishment
Right.
for everything.
Right.
And Dr. King says, for through violence you may murder a murderer, but you can't murder murder.
Right. Right. It doesn't bring about what you think it's going to bring about, unless your true purpose is just vengeance, and then that's a whole other problem.
Darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that.
That's right.
Years ago, New York State had capital punishment for drug dealers.
Yeah.
And what they found out that the drug dealers knew they were going to be executed, so they'd shoot it out with the police. Kill policemen,
Yeah.
kill innocent people.
Yeah.
So they rescinded that. Eventually, calmer heads prevailed.
And I think that's what, and like almost all of his other speeches, he ends with the sort of tying it together with the gospel. And so he says, look, we have these tasks, we have these things we must do, but it's going to be difficult. He quotes one of his favorite inspirational people, James Weldon Johnson, who says, who's a poet, says, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed." In other words, all this stuff was hard for them. It's going to be hard for us, but we just have to keep pushing, and we have to keep working.
I appreciate toward the end of Dr. King's speech where he gets people motivated.
Yeah.
When the part where he keeps saying, "Let us be dissatisfied, let us be dissatisfied," and it's amazing, and it's no wonder that people would be up on their feet.
No, there's no wonder at all. Even just listening to the YouTube clip, I get all excited. And I was only 5 when Dr. King was killed, so this is not close to my own personal experience at all. Yet the truth is just so stark and right there in front of you, and telling us what to do, right to our faces, and right to our ears, I should say.
Yes, and suggesting is this: open your eyes. This is what we ask people to do, Professor. We ask people to walk through life with their eyes wide open, to live their life rather than get through it. How many times have you heard people say, "Oh, I wish this day were over," or "Turn the channel"?
Yeah, well, unless you're going to die in your sleep, tomorrow's another day.
Right. So, and again, in the Christian Bible, they talk about this king that stores all of his goods in all these barns, and it just accumulates this fantastic wealth. And the angel of death comes to him that night and says, "You fool, this very night your life will be required of you."
Right, exactly, yeah. And that's we have to start thinking. Oh, I almost said think out of the box. Sorry, folks. That's a terrible cliche. But we have to start thinking outside of ourselves that way. And again, I think reconcentrating, refocusing on the details of work.
What's important?
Right. You said, what is it? You said in the 12-step program, do the next best thing.
Do the next right thing.
Do the next right thing. That's a fantastic concept.
Do the next right thing.
thing.
If anybody has seen the Frozen 2 movie, it's excellent. I took my grandchildren to see it. Excellent movie. And there's a whole song in there, and that's what the refrain is. Do the next right thing. Do the right thing. I'm thinking to myself, this is 12-step talk.
Somebody owes somebody some royalties.
Well, it's definitely 12-step talk. But what we try to do, Professor, is try to help people figure out what's important. There are so many things in life that are not.
And I think if we don't examine the details of what's going on, then we won't learn what's important. And I think that's what Dr. King is telling us in
When
the
people
speech.
figure out what's important, and I'll tell this story a little bit. It's in my origin story, but I had a great uncle years ago. He and his brothers, one of them was my great-great-grandfather. They owned a department store. They had some means, and the Depression came. and people naturally would buy things on credit. And these people were bringing back the couches, bringing back things and saying, Mr. Armeyer, we treated this well. We didn't take any, but we can't pay for it, and we're returning it. It broke his heart.
Yeah.
And one day he put an ad in the paper, and it said, I, Harry Ellermeyer, as of this day, forgive all debts, both business and personal. And it ruined him. It ruined the man financially. He lived with my great-grandfather the rest of his life. And they often asked him, they said, Harry, why did you do that?
Yeah.
Because the banks weren't as gracious.
Oh, no.
Okay,
No,
weren't
no,
as
no.
forgiving. And he always said it was the right thing to do.
It was the right thing to do, and it probably gave him immense internal peace.
So when my family, we always have a tradition on Memorial Day. We go up and take care of the graves. They're all together. And I tell this story. I said, he may not be the richest man in this cemetery, but he may be the best man in this cemetery.
Yeah, that's right. And by his deeds shall you know him. And
Yes.
that's how you know him, is because
That's
of
correct.
what he did. Yeah.
That's correct. So what is all these things avail you? But of course, we have to be realistic. You have to have something to put gas in your car.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
This isn't, flights of fancy and wandering around the world with just in a toga and
Yeah. but King is saying, don't boycott the absolute necessities of life. You have to get your potatoes, you have to get your meat, you have to get this to live, but you don't have to buy seal-test ice cream.
That's correct.
You don't have to drink Coca-Cola. Those are luxuries. And if you can assert economic pressure on a company to behave better by withdrawing your funds, withdrawing your dollar, then you can bring change about.
Yes. It's amazing that they wouldn't want people to swim in their swimming pool, but they'd want them to spend money in their stores.
Right. Or they want the same people to clean their swimming pool, but not swim in it.
Yes. It's so one of the things that Jesus said was, "Who is so low they are not my brother."
No, exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
So this is one of the things that I often talk to people about, and I make no apologies that I'm not a Christian, but I follow what Jesus said. And Bill Wilson in the 12-step book said, "The Christ I conceive the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claim him."
Yeah.
The Bible's Jesus refers 184 times in the New Testament about the responsibility to help the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, the falsely imprisoned, the weak. Do you think he meant it, Professor?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Yeah.
the fact that it shows up in all four Gospels and all,
Yeah.
again and again and again.
Again and again. So my thoughts are, if whatever we cross over into, if you're before the divine, if you're before whatever it is, and that might say to you, I gave you gifts, talents, and abilities. What'd you do with them?
Right. And I think are we getting close to time? No. Well, I wanted to stress that if you use those talents and abilities in the best way, do the next right thing, and if the community uses its talents and abilities and does the next right thing, then you can talk about getting to a better future because you will have accomplished it. The most moving part of the speech, and I want to apologize to the listeners, is that I'm going to read it out, and I think you
Please.
should definitely go online and hear the speech, or email me, info@professorbuzzkill.com. That's a little plug there, a little shameless plug. And I'll send you a copy of this speech that I sent to Jim, and I'll send my explanation of why I think it fit into the show. And I think you get a lot out of it. But anyway, he says, remember, he's talking in this whole speech about the idea, where do we go from here? Okay. And he's saying, if we do these things that we've done before, the consumer boycotts, the political pressure, we will reach a point where, and this is what he says, this is our hope for the future. And with this faith, because of what people have done, what the people in the movement have done, we will be able to sing in some not too distant tomorrow with a cosmic past tense. We have overcome. We have overcome. Deep in my heart, I did believe we would overcome. So he's saying we need to get to that. We need to get to that point where we can use that cosmic past tense because we did it.
You've seen the signs up there go from saying I have cancer to I had cancer.
Right.
But however that takes that takes a team effort to get that done.
Right. And I think if people go back and they look at these things, the detailed work that goes into all of this and all of their own personal struggles, they'll take heart from it.
We often talk about, well, that person's lucky, this person's lucky. There is no such thing as luck as far as I'm concerned. One of the things that Benjamin Franklin said, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Imagine that. There is chance, of course, like a pigeon pooping on your head if you're walking through Pittsburgh. But
it's never happened to me, by the way.
Their luck has been defined as when preparation meets opportunity.
Well, sure, yeah.
So preparation, it's the action and effort. I often tell people when I talk at rehabs, I say, you know what? The two words that mean the most to me in 12-step recovery are not God or spirituality. It's action and effort.
Mm-hmm.
Action and effort.
And then you can eventually employ that cosmic past tense. I did overcome.
Indeed. So our challenge out there to every one of these, our challenge podcasts, is to inventory your gifts, talents, and abilities. Use those. Enhance those. Find out what works in your life. Too often we concentrate too much on the negative aspects in our life and go back and find out how that happened. I'm challenging everyone out there, when you had a good time in your life, when things were well, add to and reinforce the things that work. And as always, at the end of every podcast, we offer a free prescription, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Unplug your television and take up fishing.
Yes, absolutely.
And for a truly mindful experience, we suggest that you fish without bait. Do a kindness for another. Do a kindness for Do a kindness for another. Do a kindness for yourself. Forgive yourself and forgive another. Till all are free, none are free. Until next time, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Namaste.
Thank you for having me.